I'd like to welcome everyone to this fourth in a series of 7 webinars that BEAMA is running to talk about how we get to net zero in homes, and particularly focusing on the technologies produced by BEAMA members. This session is talking about net zero homes and health, and I'd just like to start by introducing our panelists today. We've got Professor Tim Sharp, who's Head of Architecture at Strathclyde University, and also Chair of the HEMAC network, which stands for the Health Effects of Modern Airtight Construction. We've got Kieran Wright, Residential Smart Homes Category Manager at Schneider Electric. Keith Ritchie, who's Executive Chairman of Titan and also chairs the BEAMA Ventilation Group. And Sean Deans, who's Account Manager at Emotive, a global healthcare communications agency. I'd also like to say for all the people who are joining the webinar today, we would like this to be interactive if we can. You'll see at the bottom right of the screen, there's a button for Ask a Question. If you want to put your questions in there at any point during the session, we'll try and feed them into the panel. And also there's a chat box as well if you've got anything to say, which we might also feed into the discussion. But I'd like to kick off today with the first question to Tim Sharp. And as we move towards net zero homes, are we in danger of making the health of occupants worse?
Yes, if we don't do it right. And one of the challenges of the construction industry is that we quite frequently don't do things right. I mean, one of the challenges is that as we make buildings more energy efficient, we improve the fabric and we make them more airtight. What that means is that the ventilation provision has to be designed and has to be installed. Nothing happens by accident anymore. It has to be produced, and it has to be effective, and it has to last for long periods of time. So there's a balancing act to be made there. If we get it wrong, then there's a challenge. We are going to have buildings which are less well ventilated, and we know there are clear relationships between ventilation and health. So that's not a reason not to make buildings more energy efficient. It's just a reason to do it as best we can.
Okay, thank you. And moving on to Keith. I mean, the heat and building strategy came out this week. And within that, I mean, it's quite clear that they saw that ventilation and indoor air quality were things that can provide wider benefits from net zero homes. I just wonder, I mean, we do talk about the problems a lot, but should we start to be thinking about healthy homes as a positive benefit rather than something that we just have to try and avoid not getting there?
Yes, Colin, I think it's a really good question. And I guess the first thing to say is it's really welcome in the heat and building strategy that the government has focused on health and ventilation as being so important, and reiterating the point that Professor Tim Sharp has just made, that if we get the ventilation wrong, then we will simply store up more and more problems for home occupiers going forward. So yeah, I think that's a really positive message, and of course the pandemic has also highlighted the importance of good ventilation for health, and the government has made a number of utterances about ventilation, which is really positive. So let's take it a stage further and say, well, what's not to like about a healthy home? And you know, I've just highlighted some of the things that we can all benefit from. Good lighting. I think good lighting is really, really important in a house. Good thermal comfort, both hot and cold. It's no good having a cold home in winter and too hot home in the summer. So making sure that homes are built to mitigate both extremes is really important. Noise is an issue. You know, if you live on a busy road or next to some kind of industrial site, whatever it is, roads, airports, trains, noise can be a real blight on people's homes, and making sure that noise is mitigated is a really positive as far as health is concerned. Better accessibility is also a really important aspect of a healthy home, so that people can stay in their homes if they suffer in later life issues with their mobility. And then coming back to indoor air quality, we all know the benefits of good indoor air quality, because that leads to better physical and mental health for the occupants, and that has a whole range of benefits to society as a whole. I'll highlight two. We know that educational attainment is improved for our children with a good indoor environment with those positive attributes that I've just highlighted. And probably most importantly, improving well-being also reduces the cost for the NHS. So I see it as a massively positive thing to have, and what's not to like about being positive on this and having these attributes in our housing stock.
Okay, thanks, Keith. I've just noticed a comment in the chat saying there's no names on the screen to identify which speaker is which. I won't say who is who, because you might have them in a different order on your screens. I know how these things can work, but I certainly, for me, if you put your mouse onto the people on screen, their name will come up, so that you might find that helpful as people are talking. Just moving on, but I think staying on the theme of positive benefits, smart technologies are one of the areas that I've often talked about in the context of future homes and net zero homes. And just for Kieran, really, I mean, is there a role for smart technologies to protect people's health and well-being in the future?
I think absolutely. Moving forward, we're going to have a connected system within the home. So we'll highlight, may there be a CO2 sensor that will identify that we need to increase ventilation if there's only if initially there's only a manual system in place. So we will have smart technologies on our phone. A lot of people have connected heating systems, so that could just be a flag from the sensor saying, part of CO2 in the home are at too high a level or too low a level. So from a manual point of view, you can increase that. And then moving forward, a more connected solution all the way around. Why potentially run, from an efficient point of view, why potentially run the ventilation system if both the front and back door are open in the home when we've got natural airflow there? So I think some of the points that Keith mentioned there about being able to still live in your home when you're maturing in age, things like occupancy sensors, so we can monitor if people are actually moving. We can monitor the health of people. So, if there's no movement in the house, then maybe we need to identify and raise some alarms. So smart technology is actually going to be the centre of all these technologies and control the inputs and outputs. And moving forward, we'll definitely help the health of the building moving forward. And also the fabric of the building, so we can have as a CO2, we can have humidity sensors, leak detection sensors. So when we look at the fabric of the building, if there's a leak under the bath, I mean, it seems simple, but that moisture just going into the woodwork, deteriorating the fabric of the building, it's having an effect with mold. Again, it's going to affect health. So a small wireless leak detection sensor which flags up on your phone, your smart device, to say there's a potential leak here. I think it's very key to all these technologies moving forward.
Right, and I guess from what you're saying, then we could be going into an area where you've got sort of diagnostics for the technologies in there, but also for the people in the home as well.
Absolutely. I have a smart watch, and if I'm in a long meeting like this, maybe an hour or so, it gives me a little peep to say you haven't moved for a few moments. And so we're already adopting these technologies in other areas of our life. We probably just need to make a focused attempt at saying, well, actually, we can use these to our benefit in a home environment.
Okay, thanks very much. Just moving on to Sean, I know in your course of your work, you talk to politicians a lot of times, and obviously, we've said the heat and building strategy talks about health and well-being as a positive benefit, talks about a lot of positive benefits of this. But do you think there is really the political appetite to make this happen?
In short, sort of. Just to give people a bit of background, obviously, Colin mentioned at the start that I work for Remotive, which is a global communications agency, and over the last 7 years, we've been working with the BEAMA ventilation group to try and drive the indoor air quality and ventilation agenda. And so that's given us across a range of communication and public affairs activities. So that's given us a really good understanding of exactly where politicians stand on this issue. And I would say if you'd have asked me this question 2 years ago, I'd have said we've made some very incremental changes. And then over the last 2 years, for fairly obvious reasons, we've seen rapid development in terms of the perception amongst policymakers and politicians on the issue of ventilation. And actually, just before this started, I did a quick check on Hansard, and I had a quick look at the 19 months before March 2020 when we went into lockdown, and then I looked at the 19 months after March 2020, and there was, in the 19 months before, there was 31 references to ventilation in Parliament and 32 written questions from parliamentarians to ministers on ventilation. And since then, there's been 244 references to ventilation in Parliament and 297 written questions. So in short, we've seen rather rapid development in terms of appetite and interest in the issue of ventilation. I think that's kind of culminated in far more pressure as well. So, there's far more scrutiny out government around ventilation policy, far more questions. And so there's much more of a need to act. And, certainly in recent weeks and months, they've been emphasising this recent pledge to 300,000 CO2 monitors, which, some people may say, oh, that's not enough. And, I'd agree with that. But they're emphasising it. They're trying to find ways of answering these questions. And why are they trying to do that? Well, because they're being scrutinised for it. And we are just seeing more broadly BASE, the Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities, so formerly MHLG, all taking far more of an interest, far more engagement and more appetite to change things. And, I was informed by a civil servant recently that there is far more of a drive towards interdepartmental working on this issue. And there are now mechanisms in place. We don't know what those look like, but there are more mechanisms in place to facilitate that. What I would say is that on the flip side, in terms of a concrete plan for delivering improvements to health and well-being, those are a little bit thin at the moment. I think, as you mentioned, the heat and building strategy, very strong in terms of messaging and aligning things like insulation improvements with and energy efficiency improvements, saying that they need to be done, alongside ventilation. But, it's not like we've got, okay, here's X amount of money that we're dedicating to this area over the next 10 years for installation of these measures. And I think we do need to progress towards that position. But I would say at the start of this year, we set out, one of our kind of key slogans from our campaigning on, in terms of the BEAMA ventilation group was ventilate when you insulate. And I think the heat and building strategy, as published earlier this week, really does deliver on that message, and it's much more stronger. So there's still some way to go, but we are in a much better position than we were maybe 2 years ago.
Thank you. Just moving on to Tim. Sean mentioned there about the increase in questions being asked, but has the COVID pandemic sharpened people's attention on indoor air quality and ventilation? Because again, I think it's one of those areas there's a lot of noise, but we're not necessarily seeing some real action on ventilation.
Yes, no, I think it has. It's one of the things that the initial kind of messages around COVID were kind of washing your hands and stuff like that. Hands, face, space. What then became communicated probably about this time last year actually is fresh air as well, the need to kind of ventilate. And I think that really kind of raised awareness of ventilation as an issue. I think it raised a lot of questions in people's minds around, well, how do I do it? What is it? What is good ventilation? So I think it's certainly going to raise people's awareness of it, both in at home, but also in kind of in their workplaces and places of education as well. So I think there is something about a raised interest in it. I think one of the challenges with ventilation is its invisibility. So people are very familiar with thermal comfort, and most people will open and close windows to control their temperature and things like that. But air quality, pollution, these things are not visible in quite the same way. It has to be really pretty bad before you sort of feel the need to do something there. So I think that's sort of quite interesting where technology is kind of coming in relation to use of sensors. Someone mentioned CO2 sensors earlier. Again, lots of people have heard about these things now. It's an example of a fairly kind of what is becoming a fairly ubiquitous technology, and I think that will be useful. The analogy I had for this was that at the moment it's been a bit like driving a car without a speedometer. right? You don't know, you've got a sense of how fast you're going, but you need that tool to tell you how it's doing, and that's what forms of sensor do. They give you some sort of visual feedback of, is this building doing what it's supposed to do? These are very blunt tools. These are not accurate measurements, and ventilation is interesting because it is at the same time both incredibly simple and incredibly complicated. So, the concept of ventilation, opening windows, stuff like that, everybody does it, you know what it is. But when you try to kind of quantify that or measure it, it's quite challenging. So I think, I think that's kind of where we're going with this. But I think part of that is that people have become more aware. They've started to ask questions about, well, how do I do it? What is it? Is it working? And I think these are fair questions. And I think kind of moving forward in policy and regulation, these things will need to become enshrined, really. Particularly in the context of the zero carbon agenda. In theory, these things are sort of opposing problems, wanting to kind of make buildings tight and keep everything in and not be drafty and so on, as opposed to wanting really good ventilation rates and removing pollutants and so on. These are not irresolvable problems, but they need a bit more kind of careful thinking than what we've done up to now, really.
And do you think the standards are there for, particularly, in the sense of reducing airborne transmission of viruses? Do you think there are standards there for people? So if a pub or a restaurant decided it wanted to put ventilation in to make a safe space for their customers, that there are standards there, or is the message just if you put ventilation in, that's to current standards, that's good enough?
Well, I think that's one of the issues, that if a building was meeting current standards, then that's probably going to be that'll be okay. Actually, that should be okay from a COVID perspective. The sort of the indication has been really from COVID that what we should be concerned about is poor ventilation. That's the biggest kind of concern. So something which meets existing regulations, should be okay in that respect. The question is, does it do that? Because a lot of buildings are legacy buildings. They've been around sometimes for hundreds of years. They've been changed. They've been adapted. Stuff has come and gone. So I think that's a bit of a challenge, trying to understand what things are as we speak. Something which is built recently to building regulations has been properly commissioned and verified and tested. You would expect that would kind of work. But other things that may be a bit more of a kind of grey area and worthy of greater investigation.
Thank you. And I mean, sticking with ventilation, because we know ventilation can be an effective solution to indoor air quality. But at the moment, Keith, what's stopping us making sure that every home has good ventilation?
Yeah, another good point, Colin. There are a bunch of things that could impact on this. A lot of the housing stock is, as Tim was just alluding to, has been around for many, many years and has probably not been improved over that time. And they are dependent on kind of the leaks in the house to provide a lot of their ventilation, through the doors, windows, under the floorboards, ceilings, things like that. But as soon as you do put insulation in, then you do seal up a lot of those sources of ventilation, and that's when you really do need to start thinking about insulation. And unfortunately, I think government is now becoming more aware of that, certainly in building regulations and in the PAS regime. There is much more of a focus on ventilation, but a few things that will also improve the ventilation in properties. We need higher standards for installing ventilation products. There are too many systems which are installed which don't work as they should work, as designed, either through poor awareness of how they work or just a bad installation. So having higher standards of installation is really important. I think one of the things I will also highlight is public awareness of the benefits of good ventilation, and we've already talked a bit about that this morning, and particularly with COVID. One of the things that Sean and I have been concerned about over quite a few years is the lack of public awareness and the lack of drive from government to make people aware through what was Public Health England. I know they've got lots of other health issues which they are highlighting, but we've struggled to get that message across to them that the good indoor air quality is a real positive attribute for people's health, and trying to get public awareness up, which will then force industry and government to do more, I think is really important. Lack of money is another reason, and I know we're going to come on and talk about that in a bit more detail. But if we provide an incentive for people to improve their ventilation through some sort of government measure, I think that is a really good way of focusing on the needs for good ventilation and making sure that good products are installed. So I think that's important. And then I think just coming back to the final point on this I'd like to make is that when people are installing ventilation, both in new build and in retrofit, we need to make sure that the building regulations are actually enforced. And there's been a real lack of measures taken by building control, local authorities, whoever that is, to ensure that the ventilation that is installed is sufficient and fit for purpose. So there are a bunch of reasons why we haven't ensured that good ventilation has been installed in the housing stock, and we need to do better in those areas.
Okay. And just one other aspect of that about training as well, because I mean that's another area in the heat and building strategy that's highlighted, and I think mostly around sort of heat pump installations and so on. But is that an issue in the ventilation sector as well?
Yeah, yes, it is. I mean it's interesting how much reference there is in the heat and building strategy to training, and of course there will be, because they need to convert a lot of gas installers over to become heat pump installers according to that document. But we've been frustrated by the lack of training for installers of ventilation, and at the minute in the UK you don't need any qualification to install ventilation products. You can be a plumber or electrician or a tradesman, and you can install ventilation. And one of the things that as an industry we've been trying hard to do is to drive up those standards. We've been encouraging ventilation installers to be trained. There's a scheme they can sign up to at NIC, EIC. They can go on the training course and then be accredited. And we need to see more of that. And what's pleasing about that is that in the Green Homes Improvement scheme, which the government announced this time a year ago, I know it's no longer here, but one of the things they did do in that was to try and make sure that all installers were Trustmark accredited, and that then makes sure that standards are maintained, because it would do all of us a real disservice if these products, and I'm not just talking about ventilation products, but heat pumps and other technologies, if they are badly installed, that will really set us back a long way. So driving up standards, having good training, enforcement, compliance is a really important aspect of it, and will hopefully something that will improve going forward.
Okay, thanks. I mean, if we move that question along to Kieran as well, just in terms of smart technologies, I mean, are these technologies things that are foolproof, that can just be put in, plug and play, or are they things that are going to see equal problems in terms of getting the right trained people to install them?
I mean, training across the industry, whether it's ventilation, electrical, mechanical, we know there's a skill shortage, and we know as a nation we need to drive that training, because of all these new technologies moving forward, there's a lot of work to do to get us to net zero by 2050. From a manufacturer's point of view, we're making it easier for these systems to work together. So if you imagine if you've got a smart speaker in your home now, you've probably got some maybe a light bulb connected or a smart plug, and how easy was that to connect to the Wi-Fi seamlessly these days? So we're not saying that these new technologies are going to necessarily be that simple, but from a manufacturer's point of view, we have to have that in mind because for the adoption to be taken up and to accelerate the adoption, we need to make these systems able for people to pick up intuitively.
Thank you. I'm just noting a comment from Tim Freeman in the comments section there about tenant engagement and getting tenants to understand that ventilation does not equal a draft. You know, and I think this is one of the things that when we talk about net zero from a policy perspective and large scale, we're thinking about something we're doing to people. Well, obviously we need people to engage with this and to want to do it, in a lot of cases to spend money on improving their homes. So, I mean, just a question for Sean, really. I mean, how do we encourage householders to invest in their homes, you know, with a view to making it healthier in the future?
Yeah, so there's kind of two key strands to this. The first one, which is what I've got written in front of me on my notes: education, because ultimately that's going to make people interested in this topic. They're going to be more aware of the implications of a poor a house which is of poor quality and isn't positive on their health, and that's really just rooted in the lack of awareness and understanding really of just how significant the impacts of a poor indoor environment can be on our health. And this means that people just don't want to pay. If we've seen it recently with the heat pumps. I was doing a quick brief view on Twitter of just, what some of the comments around that. And even with the grants, right, between £5,000 to £6,000, people are still saying, well, who's going to spend their money on this at this stage? What does it actually mean to people? So I think that is a significant challenge, and we need to therefore drive awareness, and the government needs to drive awareness, which I know Keith touched on earlier, so that people are more aware. If they were aware as we were, I think people would be far more inclined to pay, but they're not. And certainly they won't be reading the heat and building strategy like we are, so they won't be getting those messages from government of just how important these things are. So we have still a mission and one that we really want the government to buy into as well, to get people aware of this stuff, and they need to be aware of this stuff. And again, just building on a point that was made by Tim earlier, tangibility, such a difficult challenge, and one that is, I think, a bit of a barrier to people investing money into this, and something we need to overcome. What energy efficiency has going for it over and above everything else is the fact it saves people money, or that's the perception, is that it saves people money. And at the end of the month, when you're paying your bill, that's what your average person will care about, and that's why it has traction. And I think we need to try and get people to think about qualify things in terms of around fire safety or energy efficiency. We need people to start thinking about ventilation, indoor air quality, and the other issues that Keith listed earlier. We need to get people thinking about those in the same way that we do energy efficiency. So I think, just to build on that, what COVID has done is it's kind of made, and certainly on the issue of ventilation, it's made people aware that, okay, ventilation is critical to mitigating ventilation inside your home. Take that more broadly. If it's doing that to COVID, then what's it going to be doing to wider viruses, and what's it going to be doing to other airborne pollutants inside the home? And trying to convey that message and broaden it out so that people go, hang on a minute, this is actually a much, it's not like ventilation was created just to solve the issue of COVID. It's actually to solve a much broader array of issues around airborne pollution, etc. So we need to start conveying that message. Also, if I'm talking to someone who doesn't know about this, I immediately start with something like mold, because mold's tangible to people. It looks bad and it's immediate. So it's something that they can immediately see in front of them and go, that's bad. So, and we saw it earlier this year with the ITM report on mold. As soon as that story came out about mold in social housing, people went up in arms. It was a disgrace, and it's no kind of surprise when we submitted a response to the Decent Home Standard review, which is ongoing at the moment. We got the question. They're asking a question now about, okay, what should this Decent Home Standard be saying about ventilation? And when we spoke to the lady who's leading that review, she said, oh, well, we've noticed lots of issues around mold. So we know that these issues, once people are aware of them, once people see them, are things that are dealt with. So we need to increase that tangibility. I think the other challenge with it is as well that there's no one solution to fix the problem. So if you try and present someone what does a healthy house look like, it's multifaceted, and therefore it requires, it's not just I pay for one thing and it solves all my problems. You need to pay for multiple things, and that's kind of leading on to my kind of final point, which is that ultimately government needs to invest money into this. But I think Tim touched on it earlier. We shouldn't be afraid of making small steps in the first instance. So things like mandatory installation of CO2 monitors could be a really good step forward. Is it going to give us the entire picture of indoor air quality inside people's homes? No. Is it going to start that process? Yes. And it might give us some pictures. So we shouldn't be afraid of that just because it doesn't deal with the issue, in its entirety straight away. And so just moving on now to that second point, which is a much shorter one than the first one, and is a simple one really, which is that ultimately government needs to put more money behind this stuff. This is not, net zero is going to be expensive to achieve, and to achieve it in a way that is protecting people's health and well-being is going to be even more expensive, and they have to put money behind it because that is ultimately what's going to incentivize people to invest their own money to buy these things. Because if we don't, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds who are perhaps living in some of the most poorest quality homes, they need all the support they can get to ensure that these things get installed. So we've seen recently with the Treasury, of course, there's been a bit of friction between them and BASE, which has come out into the fold and around that issue of cost. But ultimately, if we want to get this right, then it's going to have to start with money from government, and then of course to build that alongside dedicated awareness and understanding around the impact of unhealthy housing and how we can mitigate that.
Okay, thanks. Just move back to Tim, because obviously you mentioned a couple of things he'd said in there, so you might want to come back on those anyway. But about the point that Tim made in the comments about the sort of tenant engagement, and how do people behave with ventilation systems? I know you've done research on how systems work in the field, but how much of that is affected by how people use them?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So the kind of studies that we've looked at, what they've tended to find is that when you ask people about how they use their ventilation, why do you open your windows? It's because it's too hot. Why do you close those windows? I'm worried about heat loss. It is thermal comfort and sort of fuel poverty and energy use, which is the primary driver for those types of behaviours. As I said sort of earlier, things have to be getting very sort of, in a sense, tangible before people start to sort of open windows. So if you're having a party or someone's burnt the toast or something like that, that's when people will kind of interact. What was interesting is that when we asked people, what is your perception of your indoor air quality in this home? What do you think it's like? Most people said, no, it's fine. It's actually pretty good. When we measured it, it was actually pretty poor, and particularly in certain types of spaces, so sort of bedrooms and where people are sort of in all night, things like that. The other interesting thing is that when we asked people what advice have you had about ventilation, pretty much nobody had any advice. It was extremely rare. There was just this sort of notion that people would just sort of understand and pick it up. But I think that's quite difficult. And particularly where you have more sophisticated systems, more mechanical systems perhaps. But even with simple kind of ventilation. We have sort of slightly lost a sort of, an understanding of how buildings kind of work and how to use them. So I think there is something important in terms of giving people really good and clear advice about what their systems are, how they are supposed to work. Because I think that's kind of missing. People are really just sort of making things up on the spot pretty much. And as I sort of said, a lot of that is driven really by thermal comfort and energy use rather than trying to manage indoor air quality. I mean, just to pick up on one other thing, however, something that Sean said, I mean, people are motivated by energy consumption, and that is primarily to do with fuel costs and fuel poverty, to an increasing degree, perhaps, about things of kind of climate change and so on. But also I think that people are pretty motivated by health. That's, in a sense, a more immediate concern for many people, and particularly for certain groups, people with health vulnerabilities or young children. So I think, in a sense, this is what we're seeing is an increasing awareness of that as an issue and a problem. So, people might do stuff more readily to sort of manage their health in a way that they might not do, primarily about energy. So I think that's an interesting sort of juxtaposition we've got there.
Thank you. And Kieran, I mean, just on that issue about tangibility, I mean, obviously with more sensors in the home and people can see that. You talked about the one on your wrist telling you to move around. I mean, do we actually see that people engage with that technology if they haven't made a choice to have it installed, or does it depend on whether they want to know that information first?
I think if you look at from the bigger macro environment, the people who have wireless light bulbs or plugs at the moment, they're feeding into the health because they're reducing their the consumption on the grid. So overall, it's having a positive effect on the environment. I think as we move on in the years, when these connected issues first arose, the theme of Big Brother and everyone's watching me do things, and people got eyes on me. I think that's becoming less so when people are seeing more so the value and also the convenience of it. So whereas before, now having a smartphone with all your details on, we've been able to see, well, actually, the humidity in this kitchen is too high. Maybe, the paint starting to peel in social housing. We're starting to see mold spots. Then we need to, it's a physical, it's a tangible, as Tim says, it's a tangible evidence of a need to improve the ventilation. So I think, there's lots of things have been said in this panel so far about awareness to people. And coming from an electrical background, some great points there on the ventilation. It's until you question it, you don't understand that there is an issue with it. So I think as the awareness changes, people will definitely buy into it.
Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to come back on that particular point and why I think things like monitors and digital applications and appliances are going to be so useful is that they in themselves provide something that is tangible, i.e. like a digital number in front of you. And I've said this before, and certainly to Tim before, that in Scotland recently, new builds now have to have mandatory installation of CO2 monitors. Conveniently, my parents have recently bought a house in Scotland. It's a new build, which has got a CO2 monitor installed in the bedroom. Since having that installed, my parents have kept tabs on that, and when it goes above the level that it states on the actual thing on the wall, they open their windows, and then once it goes down, that they're happy again. So, and we shouldn't underestimate just how that sounds so simple, but we shouldn't underestimate just how impactful that can be. Most recently, I've started paying more attention to my step count, and now I'm hitting a certain target every day. It's literally a digital number in front of me. It's not that complicated, but psychologically you want to hit that every day. And similarly in people's bedrooms, you see the CO2 monitor, it goes above a certain level, you want to get it down. And we shouldn't underestimate just how impactful that can be on people's behaviour. So I just wanted to make that point to emphasise just how helpful smart technology can be in assisting that.
Just back to Sean there. That monitor in your parents' home, is it a traffic light system? Is it red, amber, green, or is it actually a readout?
I couldn't tell you the details,
right,
to be honest. All I did was my mum mentioned it a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, well, that's interesting. So I can look into it for you, though.
Well, absolutely. So, we as you've mentioned, that the cost of these systems and monitors, that it's massive because of the amount of the housing stock we have. But just a simple, instead of having an active sensor where it gives you the readout of X amount parts per million, I've designed systems in schools where they have a traffic light system, so they know that if the attention of the young people in the classroom has ebbed a little bit, it'll go to amber and then to red, and then an automated system will crack the windows to let that CO2 in. But certainly from a starting point, you just need inbuilt thresholds within that sensor, maybe just to give you a little traffic light system. And again, we're seeing wireless thermostats, wireless TRVs for radiators. There's no reason why we can't. The next step is to include some of these more active sensors, and instead of beeping to say, oh, I need to move because I've been sat down for so long, it's a beep to say actually the CO2 in the room you're in, so you don't actually have to have maybe an active sensor on the wall. It could be on your watch. So it really does open a whole area of increased technology that we have convenient use for, and you can tangibly see what's going on.
Can I just add a couple of things to that? So firstly, So a couple of things. So firstly, when we did a bit of work leading up to that, and that resulted in that introduction of CO2 sensors. When that happened, when those regs came in, there was a lot of sort of concern about it, saying, "Oh, we're going to get hundreds of complaints," and that didn't happen. That didn't happen, and so that sort of the sky will fall in sort of thing, it wasn't as bad, and I think that's quite interesting, in the sense that things may not be a problem everywhere. But what it may do is firstly sort of avoid the problem, and secondly it may concentrate attention to where there is a problem which needs to be fixed. Now we've seen this in a couple of other things. So there's some stuff which has been done around COVID recently in schools in Scotland, in which they've been using CO2 sensors. And what that sort of found is that actually most of the classrooms were generally sort of okay. A few of them weren't, and so what that allowed them to do is to go and see what the problem was in those spaces and fix it. So it's a really kind of useful kind of diagnostic tool. So I don't think the industry should be afraid of these things. I think these become useful. One of my big things is that something we don't do in the construction industry is that we don't evaluate the performance of our buildings as a matter of course. So we don't know what works and what doesn't. And you can't think of any other sphere of industry or manufacturing which wouldn't test its kind of products. So the ability to do that allows us to learn from those things, to see what works, what doesn't. If it's not working, how do we fix it? How do we do it next time? And this is just one element of that. So I think, is actually a net benefit, both to the industry and the people who use those buildings.
And I think on that, in terms of the CO2 sensors in homes in Scotland, I don't think the analysis has been done on that yet. But I just wonder whether, from a builder's perspective, if there's going to be a CO2 monitor in there and it might give you problems, as you said, that you might pay a bit more attention to getting the ventilation right in the first place.
There's that, and there is also the bit which you mentioned earlier. There is also something about making sure that people have got some clear guidance on what that system is and how it is supposed to be used, because there are both those elements. Sometimes things are badly installed or incorrect, and sometimes people are not using them in a way which is intended, or So it is also a way of doing some of the kind of more soft side stuff of making sure that things are understood and used.
And Colin, can I come into that point and just say, this point about education is so important, isn't it? That back to the question about tenants and their unwillingness to let their heat out. Well, the key point there is, if you're educated as to the perils of bad indoor insulation, then you will use ventilation properly to make sure you're not affected by it. We've all seen examples of new build where the ventilation either has been installed badly, the trickle vents have been painted over. I heard somebody talking about that the other day, or the system hasn't been explained. I heard of somebody who had fans installed in the bathrooms, continuous running fans, but they hadn't been explained to them as to how they would work. And basically they were switched on and off with the isolator switch above the bathroom door. Now that is an appalling oversight by the house builder not to actually explain the system. And that's a common fault that we find, that the occupiers of buildings are not aware of how the ventilation system should work, and therefore they're just storing up problems. So education is a really important point. And just on this point about health, let's go back to that. There have been lots of studies of the cost to the NHS of poor indoor air quality. I know there's a figure that I think the Building Research Establishment put out a few years ago, £2.5 billion a year just in primary care, and other studies have highlighted the cost to the NHS. But there was also an interesting statistic that in a recent HEMAC meeting that I know some of us attended, I think 7 out of the 10 highest causes of mortality are actually respiratory illnesses, and poor indoor air quality all impact on those causes of death. So it's really trying to push at these factors to improve ventilation will help the health of the nation, the cost to the public purse of poor health, and will make life life a lot better for home occupiers. And of course, we're all spending a lot of time in our homes at the minute.
Okay, thank you, Keith. I'm keen to get in some of the questions from the audience, and I've got a few on here, and I just would encourage anyone watching to submit your questions. We'll try and get through them before the end. I'll come back to you, Keith, on this one. Questions: most mainstream builders or developers tend to be averse to MVHR, which is mechanical ventilation with heat recovery ventilation, instead relying on extract only, etc. Should the clear message be put over that as homes become more energy efficient, then MVHR will become essential?
And the answer to that is yes. As homes become tighter, the ability of a trickle vent and an intermittent extract fan to properly ventilate is significantly reduced. We know that, and I know Professor Tim Sharp has looked at that one and has spoken about that on a regular basis. Not to say that obviously trickle vents are a very important part of the process, but as we get tighter, they do fall away in terms of their ability to provide sufficient air into the property. We'd certainly advocate mechanical systems, both extract and supply and extract through MVHR. And what's interesting, I guess, with the heat and building strategy and the focus on energy saving is that, of course, MVHR, mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, let's just stress that, what you're doing there is you're saving up to 90% of the heat that you've spent, that you've incurred the bills, put into your property. You're saving that heat rather than chucking it out the window. Coming back to the question about tenants who are unwilling to open their windows, a mechanical ventilation with heat recovery system will save a significant amount of that heat. So absolutely, we'd recommend that, and that's something that we've been encouraging government to push in the building regulations going forward.
Sorry, can I, Sean?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that, and mainly because I want to bring it back to actually the CO2 monitors and why they are so important. One of the issues, and if you go to government and you say, okay, we want MVHR is the best way to improve ventilation, put money behind it, install it, they'll come back and say, well, hang on, there isn't the evidence available to support on a mass scale to support the amount of financial investment that would require to install that, install MVHR more widely. CO2 monitors begin the process of developing wider trends. One of the issues with research is that it's just not done on a big enough scale. And while there is the issue, of course, each home it's a case by case basis, depending on lifestyle choices, this, that, and the other, and therefore wider trends are harder to attain. What CO2 monitors will start to do is paint pictures around local areas, regional areas, that then can start building up an evidence base to say, okay, well, actually in this area it's particularly bad, in this area it's not so bad, etc., etc. And it starts building up this evidence base on a wider level to then start supporting, well, actually that area is terrible, so it needs, the idea of MVHR is far more it's far more viable to advocate for it in that area, because we know that the CO2 is terrible. So again, this is part of an exercise. We want to get to a point where, of course, government is supporting MVHR, but to get there, we need these other components behind it to support our mission towards that goal. So just wanted to make that point.
Okay, thank you. Another question here is asking about high relative humidity values causing dust mite problems, which in turn were one cause of asthma in young children. Just wondering if anyone knows if there is any more information on that. I'm looking at Tim on my screen here in case you.
That's quite a sort of that's quite a well-established thing. There are certain levels of moisture above which dust mite populations will proliferate. So that's one of the reasons of trying to maintain moisture. So there are a number of elements to that. One of which is source control. So where is that moisture coming from, and trying to minimise that in some way. And then it's the removal of moisture, ideally at source, so it then doesn't affect the rest of the building. There are interesting dimensions to that. So what are those sources? Well, they are the obvious things like kind of cooking and washing, but there are things like kind of clothes drying and so on. And so there is this thing about, there is a slight sort of thing about, well, people are drying clothes in their home, therefore that's what the problem is. They're causing it. Where else do people dry clothes? What are the other provision? Is there a place for storage? Tumble dryers are very expensive. A lot of kitchens don't even have space for them. What's the outside provision? And a whole bunch of climatic issues. So those are the things, reasonably done are not unreasonable, if you see what I mean. So there are those sorts of dimensions. But yeah, there is interesting at the moment, the kind of building regulations for housing is set up at sort of trying to control moisture. That's the sort of predominant thing, rather than trying to control pollutants exactly. And again, this may shift a little bit. But what that sort of says is there are balances between, in a sense, stopping the problem occurring in the first place and then mitigating the problem if it does occur. And sort of ventilation is really kind of part of the latter, but kind of widening building design and the provision and indeed space of housing is part of that also.
And there's a question just come up on chat there. Doesn't radiant heat help with humidity and limit air particle movement? Into my panel, but
not specifically, not that I'm aware of particularly. I mean, radiant heat is just a method of heat delivery into the space. Again, this is part of in a sense, the challenge to do holistic design. So again, one of the things that you can't do is think about ventilation in isolation from thinking about heating, for example. And it's one of the slight challenges we have at the moment is that heating and ventilation are two different regulations. So trying to get those to speak to each other a little bit more, I think, is important. Particularly where those elements, start to overlap. And going back to the NVHR question, that is potentially both delivering sort of heat and ventilation, but they have two different demands, and so it's quite hard to do those in the same thing. Just one other point to make about NVHR is that as an effectively running system can be really effective. Can be really efficient, recovers the heat, gives you good levels of ventilation. But it's really important that it's done right, because now you have a building which is reliant on a constantly running mechanical system. So that needs to be well designed, it needs to be well installed, it needs to be properly commissioned, there needs to be a good handover, people need to understand how it works, what it's for, and it needs to be maintained. And that's a chain, and if any one of those things break in the chain, then you have the potential for problems there. At the moment we are struggling to build houses with a hole in the wall with a fan in it that works. When we've tested houses and seen the stuff that other people have done, 70-80% are not meeting standards. Now that perhaps also goes back to the point that was made earlier about compliance and making sure that things are really doing what they are supposed to do, and how we chase that a little bit. One of the great ironies in all of this is one of the very few post-completion verification tests is the air tightness test. Mm-hmm. Most of the things are achieved at design stages by filling in a form, and so perhaps we need to sort of get more things which are much more robustly evaluated after the building is completed.
Okay, thank you. And we're just in the last 5 minutes. I'd like to just sort of go around the panel. I mean, and talk about the direction of travel at the moment. I mean, we know that there is an agenda for homes to be net zero by 2050, but with most of the work being done by sort of mid to late 2030, so very quickly. But do we also see, both in terms of regulations and sort of consumer awareness, that we're on track for those homes to be healthy at the same time? I'll start with you, Keith. Do you think we're on track for healthy homes?
I hope we are, Colin, and I think it's worth emphasising that when you look at the heat and building strategy, yes, there's a lot of conversation in there about heat pumps, but very high up on that is the government states that they're going to adopt a fabric first approach to this. Fabric first means insulation. That is going to continue to be one of the key improvements that homeowners will be encouraged to do. And as soon as you insulate, you've got to ventilate, as we've said throughout this session. So if government doesn't do that, then we will not be improving the health of the population and the value of the housing stock. So it is absolutely essential that we do the two things go hand in hand. I think the fact that government have referred to ventilation in the document is very welcome. Of course, COVID has brought that to the fore, but what we'll be looking for in the regulations that come out, both for new build and for retrofit, is that there is much greater emphasis on ventilation and the need to do it properly, as we've all talked about today.
Okay, thanks, Keith. Kieran, same question to you. Do you think we're on track for healthy homes?
It's a great plan, but I think there is a challenge there, and I think from my point of view, we've talked about the CO2 sensor, MVHR, ventilation, the heating system, the heat pumps. That sits perfectly in my position, where we have a smart home, a home controller, a BMS controller in the commercial world for a residential space that's going to take the sensors. It's going to say CO2 is this, humidity is this, and make informed decisions. Because as I think Keith said about the fan in the bathroom that was running constantly because it was just on a manual switch. For homeowners, we need to maybe take that process out and automate it by having a humidity sensor in the bathroom, CO2, temperature sensors, control the heating, maybe an occupancy. So I personally see smart technology moving forward, pulling all these strings of all these fantastic ideas that's going to bring these tangible visualizations of what's going on with the ventilation and the heating, and making informed decisions that then to turn the heating on, to increase the ventilation rate. And also things like, you talked about the maintaining the MVHR, the amount of those, AHUs and MVHRs I've been to, and I've taken the filter out and it's absolutely black, and that's obviously going to increase efficiency. The fact that all the filter hasn't been changed is going to potentially increase other health issues within the air system. So, it's a much bigger picture, I think.
Thanks, Kieran. Sean, same to you. Do you think we're on track for healthy homes?
Simple. I mean, I'm not going to echo what Keith and Kieran have just said, but I'll just say simply that there is lots of talk now, which is great, but there needs to be delivery. We need to see what this looks like in practice, because it's all well and good talking about these issues and the government saying the right messaging, and from a communications point of view, of course, that's promising. But we need a definitive plan, concrete plan for how that's going to be delivered in light of the net zero target for 2050. And until that is done, I can't confidently sit here and say that we are on target to hit that, because we need to know, we need to see that. So that's all I'd say on that.
Thanks, Sean. And finally to Tim.
No, we're not on track. If we were on track, we would have started 10 or 15 years ago. None of these challenges are new by any stretch of the imagination. So we're not on track, but that's not to say that we can't get on track. I mean, I think one of the things which is happening is that we are probably getting more catalysts for change. And in a weird way, the sort of, this pandemic it's tested things a little bit. It's revealed things, and it's sort of shown that you can do things. In this, we sort of need a built environment equivalent of a vaccine. Do you know what I mean? In terms of a concerted effort to find a solution to something. So I think these things are possible. What's interesting is all these technologies exist. How to do it, we know how to do it. That's not the problem. It's just getting everybody to do it. I think that's where we need that bit of push. And I think there are these things about carrots and sticks. And the analogy I have in my mind is about the kind of smoking thing. So we did lots of stuff about advice and information and messaging and stuff like that. And you get sort of things ready to go, but actually it's when you introduce legislation, and you can't smoke in a pub anymore. It's done, and then you move on and start to think about the next thing. The fact is there are pushbacks with lots of these things. People who like doing the things the way they've always done them. But we know we can't do that, so we're just going to have to sort of cross that bridge, really. So it's all perfectly doable. There are no sort of insurmountable kind of technical challenge, but we just need the kind of the will and the momentum to make that happen.
think that's an excellent point to finish on. We've got the solutions, but we need the will. Definitely the case for a lot of the challenges we face at the moment. So I'd just like to say thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you to everyone who was watching. This will be available as a playback at the same link as you join. So if anyone wants to share it with anyone else or sit through the whole thing again, you'll be able to do that very soon. So thanks to everyone and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.